Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we've got something new for you. Well, AMD's pretending that it's new, but really it is just a product they released a year ago now, back in May of 2025 as a Chinese exclusive. And I guess they weren't able to sell enough of them over in China, so they're now gifting the entire world with their worst binned Navi 48 silicon. So, yippee, PC gaming hardware is just so epic right now. So what am I talking about? Well, AMD has just lifted the review embargo on, again, their new Radeon RX 9070 GRE, because apparently the Golden Rabbit Edition naming scheme seems to be here to stay, even though we're now a couple of years removed from the year of the rabbit, and GRE has to be one of the least coolest arrangements of letters you could possibly come up with for a graphics card designed for PC gaming. Anyway, positioned right below the standard RX 9070, it's supposed to be AMD's highly competitive answer to NVIDIA's RTX 5070, as well as the now heavily overpriced RTX 5060 Ti 16GB. AMD's picking it as the new mid-range value champion for 1440p gamers. Of course, as I've alluded to a few times now, it's technically not a new product, but it is new to the global retail channels, and that means if you happen to live outside of China, it has now become an option for you. So if you're unaware what it is, let's go over the 9070 GRE. Our 2026 Computex coverage is brought to you by MSI and their GeForce RTX 50 series graphics cards, including flagship models like the Supreme Liquid and Vanguard, both of which delivered class-leading results in our testing. Powered by NVIDIA's Blackwell architecture, RTX 50 series GPUs are the ultimate way to experience ray tracing, delivering more realistic lighting and visual fidelity than ever before. You'll also benefit from AI-powered DLSS 4.5 frame generation and NVIDIA Reflex for smoother, more responsive gameplay. So for more information on MSI's GeForce RTX 50 series of graphics cards, please check the links in the video description. Finally, a big thank you to G.Skill for helping make our Computex trip possible this year. G.Skill offers an outstanding range of DDR5 memory with AMD Expo support, designed to maximize AMD Ryzen performance. So for more information, please check the links in the video description. As I noted a moment ago, it's based on the same Navi 48 silicon as the RX 9070 and 9070 XT, which is why AMD are classing it as a 9070 product. But really, truth be told, I feel it's more of a 9060, and probably the current 9060 models should have really been 9050s. But AMD backed themselves into a corner on that one. It's a bit of a mess. Anyway, it is Navi 48 silicon, but it is heavily cut down. It's a binned version with 48 CUs enabled, which is 14% fewer than the standard RX 9070 and 25% fewer than the XT model. But to go along with that, whereas the 9070 and 9070 XT both feature 64 megabytes of Infinity Cache, the GRE has been downgraded to just 48 megabytes, and that's a 25% reduction. And worse still, the 256-bit wide memory bus of the original 9070 models has been cut down to 192-bit wide, and this means there's less VRAM and less memory bandwidth. The GDDR6 capacity has been reduced from 16 gigabytes to just 12, and that's a 25% reduction in VRAM capacity, while the memory bandwidth has been axed by a massive 33% down to 432 gigabytes per second. And this is a result of not only the memory bus width being reduced, but so too has the memory speed down to 18 gigabits per second. So, the 9070 GRE is a heavily cut down product, and in my opinion, no longer worthy of the 9070 branding, but despite that, AMD are looking at charging 9070 like money. In fact, believe it or not, the GRE MSRP has been set at $550 US, and that's the same MSRP that the 9070 was released with about a year ago now. Of course, today the RX 9070 does cost more than that. It's more like $600. So I guess AMD is saying that's the new MSRP for that part, and then the XT models probably moved up to more like $700, though at times it can be found for less than that. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but $550 is the official MSRP for the RX 9070 GRE. And on paper, at least, it should be 15% slower, with 25% less VRAM when compared to the RX 9070, which also came with a $550 US MSRP. So if we bump the 9070 up to $600, it's just a 10% saving that the GRE is offering for, again, like I said, probably 15% slower, 25% less VRAM, not a huge saving. So that is, if I'm completely honest, a pretty garbage deal from AMD, and it makes the 9070 GRE a complete waste of time. But hey, maybe it's not as bad as what I'm expecting. So let's fire this thing up, get the GPU test system out, and we'll go over the results. Finally, I should just mention that all of this data is fresh for this review. We went back and retested everything we wanted to include, a heap of new games. So everything's been updated in the last week for this video. So if the GRE doesn't end up being that exciting, at least you've got a whole heap of fresh data comparing these various GPUs. First up, we have Spider-Man 2 using the very high preset. When compared to the previous generation's 7900 GRE, the new 9070 GRE is really not that much of an upgrade, it seems. In fact, it's basically the same thing in this example, delivering just 5% better performance at 1440p, and then a mere 2% improvement at 4K. When compared to the RTX 5070, we're also looking at very similar performance at both tested resolutions, making the 9070 GRE 24% faster than the 5060 Ti at 1440p, and then 33% faster at 4K. Then, when compared to the RX 9070, we're looking at an 18% performance decline at 1440p and then a 17% decline at 4K. As a result, the 9070 GRE was also 12 to 16% slower than the old 7900 XT. Moving on to Forza Horizon 6 using the Extreme Quality preset, when compared to the previous generation's 7900 GRE, this new model is once again not really much of an upgrade, delivering just 8% greater performance at 1440p and then a mere 3% at 4K. When compared to NVIDIA's RTX 5070, we're also looking at virtually identical performance at both tested resolutions, and that made the GRE 29% faster than the 5060 Ti at 1440p and then 31% faster at 4K. Then, if we compare it to the RX 9070, we're looking at a very marginal 2% performance decline at 1440p and then 7% at 4K. As a result, the 7900 GRE was also 11 to 13% slower than the 7900 XT. Next up, we have Marvel Rivals using the medium quality preset. Now, when compared to the previous generation 7900 GRE, the new 9070 GRE actually takes a surprising step backwards here, underperforming the older model by around 4% at 1440p and then 11% at 4K. We also see, when compared to the RTX 5070, that the GRE falls behind in this title, trailing by roughly 11% at 1440p and then 12% at 4K. It does, however, manage to maintain a solid lead over the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, making the GRE 19% faster at both 1440p and 4K. Looking at the rest of the stack, the performance gap between the 9070 GRE and then the standard RX 9070 is quite noticeable in this example, with the GRE coming in 16% slower at 1440p and then 19% slower at 4K. Moving into Resident Evil Requiem with the maximum quality preset, the 9070 GRE actually provides a respectable generational bump over the 7900 GRE, delivering 11% more frames at 1440p and an 18% uplift at 4K, which is more substantial. Then, when compared against NVIDIA's own RTX 5070, it does slip behind, trailing by 6% at both resolutions, while remaining comfortably ahead of the 5060 Ti by 20% at 1440p and then 23% at 4K. And then when stacked against the RX 9070, we're looking at a 17% performance deficit at 1440p and then 18% at 4K. And this left the 9070 GRE roughly 3 to 9% slower than the older 7900 XT. For testing Pragmata, we're using the maximum quality preset. Now, when compared to the previous generation model, the new 9070 GRE once again only offers a very marginal improvement, delivering just a 2% performance increase at 1440p and then roughly 4% at 4K. If we compare with the RTX 5070, we see that the 9070 GRE provides virtually identical performance at 1440p, edging out by just a single frame. However, at the 4K resolution, the RTX 5070 manages to pull ahead, making the GRE about 7% slower. Then when compared to the RTX 5060 Ti, it still maintained a comfortable lead, making the 9070 GRE 33% faster at 1440p and then 27% faster at 4K. We're also seeing the performance gap between the 9070 GRE and the standard RX 9070 grow quite substantially here. The GRE fell behind the standard model by 19% at 1440p and then 22% at 4K. In Crimson Desert, we're using the cinematic preset, but we've manually disabled ray tracing, and things here take a bit of a bizarre turn. The 9070 GRE actually performs worse than its predecessor, coming in 11% slower than the 7900 GRE at 1440p and then 10% slower at 4K. It also struggles against the RTX 5070, trailing by 7 to 10%, but manages to stay 19 to 20% faster than the 5060 Ti. Stepping up to the RX 9070 yields 14 to 16% more performance than the GRE variant. And consequently, the 9070 GRE also ends up a substantial 21 to 23% slower than the 7900 XT. Testing Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty on the ultra quality settings reveals another underwhelming result. Here the 9070 GRE is 3% slower than the previous generation 7900 GRE, seen at 1440p, and then they tied at 4K. When compared to the RTX 5070, the Radeon GPU is 8 to 9% slower at both resolutions, though it still easily outpaces the 5060 Ti by roughly 29 to 32%. Then when compared to the RX 9070, we see a clear 17% performance deficit at both 1440p and 4K, which translates to the GRE being 15 to 16% slower than the 7900 XT. Looking at Indiana Jones and the Great Circle on the Supreme preset, we see that the 9070 GRE claws back some ground, beating the 7900 GRE by a 7% margin at both test resolutions. However, it can't quite catch the RTX 5070, coming in 9% slower at 1440p and then 11% slower at 4K, while remaining 16 to 20% faster than the 5060 Ti. When compared to the RX 9070, there's an 18% drop-off in performance at both resolutions. Next up we have Borderlands 4 using the very high preset. Here the 9070 GRE and RTX 5070 are essentially dead even across the board, trading very minor blows. Compared to the 7900 GRE, it's basically a wash, 2% faster at 1440p and then 3% slower at 4K. It does, however, boast a massive 33 to 36% lead over the RTX 5060 Ti. Then lining it up against the RX 9070 shows a 16% decline at 1440p and a 20% drop off at 4K. And then if you have a 7900 XT, the newer GRE is roughly 12 to 15% slower. Cities Skylines II using the high quality preset is a notoriously demanding title where no GPU on the chart manages to hit even 60 FPS. When compared to the previous generation 7900 GRE, the new 9070 GRE manages to take another step backwards in average performance, trailing the older model by roughly 7% at 1440p and 8% at 4K. Then if we want to compare with an NVIDIA GPU, such as the RTX 5070, we see that the 9070 GRE flips the script here and manages to take the lead, coming in roughly 12% faster at 1440p and then 4% faster at 4K, so a decent result there relative to the NVIDIA GPU. And against the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, it maintains a very strong advantage, delivering 31% greater performance at 1440p, but only 14% at 4K. And then if we look at the rest of the stack, the GRE trails the standard RX 9070 by about 12% at 1440p and then 11% at 4K. In Star Wars Outlaws, using the ultra quality settings with native TAA, the 9070 GRE ekes out a very marginal win over the 7900 GRE, delivering 4% greater performance at 1440p and 8% at 4K. It did slightly trail the RTX 5070 by 4 to 6%, and that allowed it to deliver a very solid 30 to 35% boost over the 5060 Ti. Finally, when compared to the standard RX 9070, we're looking at a 16 to 17% performance decline. Starfield using the ultra quality settings is a tough title for the new GRE. It takes a notable step backwards when compared to the 7900 GRE, running 10% slower at 1440p and then 7% slower at 4K. It also trailed the RTX 5070 by 7 to 9%, though it did outmuscle the 5060 Ti by 20 to 28%. The gap widens significantly when looking at the higher tier GPUs. For example, the 9070 GRE was 20 to 22% slower than the RX 9070 and RX 7900 XT, and those two happen to perform identically. Now, for Delta Force, we're using the ultimate quality preset. Here, the 9070 GRE once again fails to match the previous generation model, coming in 3 to 4% slower than the 7900 GRE. It also took a heavy beating from the RTX 5070, falling behind by 15% at 1440p and a whopping 20% at 4K, though it still beat the 5060 Ti by 18 to 21%. When compared to the RX 9070, we're looking at a steep 22 to 23% performance decline. As a result, the 9070 GRE also ended up 12 to 14% slower than the 7900 XT. For testing Space Marine 2, we're using the ultra quality settings, and here the 9070 GRE offers practically zero generational uplift over the 7900 GRE, edging it out by just 1% at 1440p and tying it exactly at 4K. It also takes a fairly significant hit when lined up against the RTX 5070, coming in roughly 19% slower at 1440p and then 17% slower at 4K, though it did manage to stay 10 to 16% faster than the 5060 Ti at those respective resolutions. Then stepping up to the standard RX 9070 reveals a 15% performance decline at 1440p and an 18% drop-off at 4K. And finally, we have Call of Duty Black Ops 7 using the extreme quality preset, and as we've come to expect, this title does heavily favour the Radeon architecture. Compared to the 7900 GRE though, the new 9070 GRE is just 1% faster at 1440p, though it does manage to stretch that lead out to 6% at 4K. But this does mean it commands a solid lead over its direct competitor, the RTX 5070, outperforming it by 14% at 1440p and then 10% at 4K, while absolutely crushing the 5060 Ti with a massive 47% performance advantage at both tested resolutions. When compared to the RX 9070, we're looking at a 9% performance deficit at 1440p, which widens to 14% at 4K. Finally, looking at the 15-game average, the overall generational picture becomes crystal clear. When compared to the previous generation, 7900 GRE, the new 9070 GRE offers absolutely zero upgrade in terms of raw FPS performance, delivering identical results with 84 FPS at 1440p and 48 FPS at 4K. When compared to Nvidia's RTX 5070, the Radeon GPU falls slightly behind on average, coming in roughly 5% slower at 1440p and 6% slower at 4K, though it does manage to outpace the 5060 Ti by a comfortable 25 to 26% across both tested resolutions. When compared to the standard RX 9070, we're looking at a clear 16% performance deficit at 1440p, which widens marginally to 17% at 4K. And as a result, the 9070 GRE also firmly trails the older 7900 XT, ending up roughly 14% slower across the board. Okay, so now we'll focus on ray tracing, and this data can get a bit alarming for the 9070 GRE. Using the ultimate ray tracing settings in Spider-Man 2, we see that it ends up being 13% slower than the 7900 GRE at 1440p, and then 19% slower at 4K. Compared to the RTX 5070, it gets decimated, trailing by over 30% at both resolutions. Most surprisingly though, the 9070 GRE is actually beaten by the lower tier RTX 5060 Ti 16GB, coming in 13% slower at 1440p and 19% slower at 4K. Spider-Man 2 is very heavy on VRAM though, and AMD's VRAM management doesn't appear to be quite as good as Nvidia's, which is likely the reason why the 12GB 9070 GRE suffers so much in this testing when compared to something like an RTX 5070. Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty is a bright spot for the 9070 GRE. Here it delivers a massive 24% performance uplift over the 7900 GRE at 1440p and 18% at 4K. However, despite this strong gen-on-gen gain, it still can't quite catch the RTX 5070, trailing by 10% at 1440p and 15% at 4K. In Marvel Rivals, the 9070 GRE manages a slight 5% win over the 7900 GRE at 1440p, but completely loses that ground at 4K, coming in 14% slower than the older GPU. Again, this could be something to do with a VRAM issue. It also fails to catch the RTX 5070 at either resolution, trailing by 4% at 1440p and then 13% at 4K, though it remains comfortably ahead of the 5060 Ti 16GB. Testing Forza Horizon 6 with the Extreme Plus RT preset enabled, we see that when compared to the previous generation 7900 GRE, the new 9070 GRE continues to struggle, actually serving as a generational downgrade here. It comes in roughly 9% slower at both 1440p and 4K, and against its main competitor, the RTX 5070, the GRE also falls short, trailing by 10% at 1440p and 13% at 4K. Then if we were to compare with the standard RX 9070, the performance gap here is quite noticeable, with the GRE performing 11% slower at 1440p and 16% slower at 4K. Next we have Resident Evil Requiem. Here the 9070 GRE essentially ties the older 7900 GRE at 1440p, but falls behind by a 4% margin at 4K. Compared to Nvidia's RTX 5070, the 9070 GRE trails by 6% at 1440p, and a more notable 13% at 4K. It does, however, maintain a healthy 14 to 22% lead over the RTX 5060 Ti 16GB. Next we have Pragmata. Things normalize a bit here. The 9070 GRE essentially ties the 7900 GRE and the RTX 5070 at 1440p, though at 4K it did drop slightly behind both GPUs by about 5%. It does maintain a strong 30% plus lead over the 5060 Ti 16GB across both resolutions. Testing Crimson Desert with the cinematic preset enabled, with RT still enabled, the RX 9070 GRE continues to face difficulties, acting as another generational downgrade when stacked against the older RX 7900 GRE. It falls behind the previous generation GPU by roughly 11% at 1440p and then 12% at 4K. Now, when compared to its direct competitor, the RTX 5070, the 9070 GRE again trails by 11% at 1440p and 12% at 4K. And then when compared to the standard RX 9070, the performance disparity widens significantly, with the 9070 GRE coming in 17% slower at 1440p and a substantial 20% slower at 4K. Looking at the overall 7-game ray tracing average data, we see that the RX 9070 GRE manages to exactly match the performance of its predecessor, the RX 7900 GRE, at 1440p with an identical 82 FPS on average, though it falls behind by roughly 7% at 4K. Now, against its primary competitor, the RTX 5070, the 9070 GRE falls short across both resolutions, trailing the Nvidia GPU by 10% at 1440p and then 14% at 4K. Now, when compared to the standard RX 9070, the performance gap remains highly noticeable, with the 9070 GRE performing a tier below, with performance that's 17% slower at 1440p and 22% slower at 4K. Okay, now for a quick look at power consumption, and please note we're combining the GPU and CPU power usage here, as Nvidia GPUs tend to ask a bit more of your CPU than Radeon GPUs do, so we feel combining CPU and GPU power is a bit more accurate for measuring power consumption of the graphics card. Now, looking at the Starfield data, we see that the RX 9070 GRE, combined with the 9800X3D, consumed 348 watts, the same kind of power draw we saw from the previous generation RX 7900 GRE. The biggest issue, though, for AMD in this title is NVIDIA's efficiency. The RTX 5070, for example, with the 9800X 3D, consumed 301 watts, meaning the 9070 GRE consumed roughly 16% more power. Then in Star Wars Outlaws, the RX 9070 GRE configuration shows a modest generational improvement in power efficiency, pulling 332 watts under load. This allows it to run slightly leaner than its predecessor, the RX 7900 GRE, which draws 345 watts. It also goes toe-to-toe with its primary competitor, the RTX 5070, beating Nvidia's card by a negligible 5-watt margin. When stacked against the rest of AMD's current lineup, it sips 11 watts less than the standard RX 9070, and a massive 111 watts less than the power-hungry RX 9070 XT. Okay, so here's the all-important cost per frame graph, the quickest and easiest way to measure the value of the 9070 GRE. Based on the 1440p data, it doesn't look too bad, certainly better value than the $450 9060 XT, but crucially worse value than the rest of the 9070 models, which ultimately means, why does anyone care, or why would anyone care about this product? Come on AMD, it's a bit pointless at this price. It has less VRAM than the 9070 and 9070 XT, it's slower, and it's not nearly cheap enough. Based on this data, it really can't cost more than $500 US, and realistically, given the missing VRAM, should probably be more like $450 US, but of course, the 9060 XT 16GB, while that certainly shouldn't be $450 US, but that is the market right now. Even so, taking the current market for what it is, the GRE has to be $500 US at most. Anything more than that, and it simply makes no sense. Just get the standard RX 9070. The 4K data is slightly less favourable, as there were a few instances where the 9070 GRE was starting to run out of VRAM, hurting performance relative to the 16GB models. It also has less memory bandwidth, which is probably a more common performance limitation at the 4K resolution. Again, at $550 US, this just isn't a product that anyone needs to or should entertain. Finally, when analysing the cost per frame based on the 7-game ray tracing average at 1440p, we see that once again the RX 9070 GRE fails to move the needle generationally. At $550, it matches the older RX 7900 GRE exactly, offering the same level of value. Then against its main competitor, the RTX 5070, the 9070 GRE does provide a slight value advantage, coming in roughly 8% cheaper per frame. However, the biggest issue for the 9070 GRE once again comes from within AMD's own current generation stack. The standard RX 9070 at $600 delivers vastly superior value, coming in 10% cheaper per frame, making the step-up option a far more sensible purchase despite the higher upfront cost. Actually, the last thing we'll look at very quickly are the operating characteristics of the Gigabyte Gaming OC and Sapphire Pulse versions of the 9070 GRE. The Gigabyte model saw a peak GPU hotspot temperature of 75 degrees in our testing, while the Sapphire card was much the same at 74 degrees. The memory on the Sapphire model hit 72 degrees, whereas it never went above 66 degrees for the Gigabyte model. That said, the Gigabyte card was slightly louder with a fan speed of 1300 RPM, while the Sapphire Pulse was almost silent at 950 RPM. That said though, the Gaming OC did typically clock 7% higher than the Pulse at 3080 MHz versus 2890 MHz. Also supporting our Computex coverage is Be Quiet and their excellent new range for 2026. Some of their latest offerings include power supplies like the Dark Power 6, AIOs such as the Pure Loop 3, additions to the light-based lineup, and a great selection of peripherals. Be Quiet's entire range is German designed, enjoying excellent build quality and silent performance. So for more information, please check the links in the video description. So there you have it. In terms of performance, the 9070 GRE slots in between the 9060 XT and 9070 XT. So like I said, it really should be called a 9060 XT, and therefore the 9060 XT should be probably the 9050 XT or something like that. Anyway, that's a problem for AMD to work out, or at least it's a problem they should have worked out, but they haven't, so sort of a whatever situation. The model names just end up being the model names. What is really important is the price and performance. That'll dictate whether the 9070 GRE is any good or not. And sadly, that's also a problem for the 9070 GRE. Coming in at the same MSRP as what the RX 9070 is meant to be selling at doesn't make a whole lot of sense, given you can currently buy a 9070 for $600 US, which is just $50 US over the alleged MSRP, and therefore just $50 more than the new GRE. We're talking about a 9% premium here. Again, just $50 for 20% better performance. That is, you get 20% better performance with the RX 9070 and 33% more VRAM, and that makes the 9070 the obvious choice at those current prices. At $500, it's potentially worth entertaining. It would potentially offer a slightly better cost per frame than the RX 9070, but it also has less VRAM, so a strong argument could be made for spending the extra $100. Still, for those that could only stretch the budget to $500, the GRE could represent a reasonable option, but at $550, it's just a waste of time. I don't really have that much more to say about the 9070 GRE. It's a year-old product now, after all, that's finally coming to the retail market, and it's doing so at an uninteresting price point. So like I said at the start of the video, yippee for PC gaming. As a side note, I did run into what are possibly a few AMD Radeon Adrenalin driver issues when testing the 9070 GRE. I lost countless hours trying to get Relive, the Radeon recording software, to work on 2 different test systems, mind you, and I never got to the bottom of it. It works on my main PC, which was using a 9070 XT, but for whatever reason, both AM5 test systems wouldn't work. Or I got one of them working briefly, and then as soon as I changed the GPU, it didn't work anymore. And one of them even had a fresh Windows install, so I have no idea what the issue is there. I also couldn't tinker with overclocking. Both the Adrenalin software and MSI's Afterburner were unable to adjust the core clocks of either of my Gigabyte or Sapphire samples. I could increase the memory frequency, which boosted performance by a few percent, but I was unable to increase the core clocks. So again, not really sure what the issue is there. AMD has confirmed they've got overclocking working on their end, so there's some kind of bug here with our test system or test systems that I'm yet to sort out. But thankfully, these bugs haven't affected the actual FPS performance that we've reported on in this video. That data is accurate. Then finally, for the ray tracing focused portion of my testing, I had to drop Indiana Jones and the Great Circle because the game refused to show the path tracing settings with the 9070 GRE installed. Now, AMD has confirmed this issue, they're aware of it. It's not a driver issue, they say, but rather the game will need to be updated to support the GRE. So hopefully that's something that should be fixed soon, and it may even be by the time you watch this video. Anyway, that is going to do it for this review of AMD's new 9070 GRE. Not exactly exciting stuff, I know, but fingers crossed we get some new exciting next-gen GPUs in the next few years or something, I guess. I don't know, we'll have to wait and see on that one. Yeah, if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, subscribe for more content. We're at Computex right now, hence the sponsor spots in this video, because this is going out during the Computex trade show. AMD didn't try and hide the 9070 GRE like we saw last year with NVIDIA's RTX 5060. They provided samples well ahead of time, so we were able to do our testing and put our review together before we hopped on the plane and flew out to Taiwan. But yeah, it's going out during the Computex week, which is a bit weird, but it's not getting buried or anything like that, so it's an interesting way of going about it. You'd think they might have announced, but then it's an old product. I don't know. It's a weird one. It is what it is. You've seen all the testing now. Like and subscribe, I think, is probably what I should say. And if you want to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness, we have the join button or Patreon. So sign up to either one of those things. You'll get some pretty cool perks. But yeah, that's going to do it. I've got to get back to doing some actual work. So I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.